This talk is called Justice Doing with Each Other, Leaning In and Doing Dignity and Respect. And my work is profoundly collaborative. So this talk is really created through 4 decades of direct action activism and solidarity with good people who have the moral courage to correct me and stick with me and stay together when it gets really hard, because we absolutely need each other. In many of the activist communities that I'm a part of, where we're really struggling to try to shift society, we're also struggling with each other because no one has got justice doing down. And so, you know, one of the things I do is I've been the clinical supervisor at the transgender-free clinic for about 6 years. And in every supervision group I've ever run at that, for that clinic, I've transgressed. And I've done something that's transphobic or at least cisnormative, you know, because that's the world we're brought up in. It's not because I'm a bad ally or a failed person. And there's no education you can get that can teach you these things. We need to be with each other on the ground across huge differences. So I want to pay a lot of respect to that community, the queer community, the trans and non-binary community. I also work a lot with sex workers and folks in the downtown east side who are disrespected, often judged and not allowed to get the services that need in terms of harm reduction. They have to lie about who they are and what they're doing in order to get things. So, you know, that community has also really pushed me to be a better ally, but through their graciousness and open-heartedness to stay with me because they think there's something of value in what I have to offer as a community worker, as a therapist who's trying to, you know, that justice doing is at the center of what I want to do. But the more we work in the margins, we know this from critical trans theory, the more we work in the margins, that's how you actually create more social justice in the center. But when you go out to the margins, we're in territories not our own. And so we're 1 foot on and 1 foot off all the time, our own locations of oppression, disadvantage, prejudice, but also living alongside our privilege and enacting all of that. It's just this huge mess. So I've also worked with survivors of torture for 3 decades now, and it's been with that community, with survivors of torture and refugees, has been the community that's most moved me in terms of doing dignity, having a dignity-driven practice, and then also the necessity of safety. And I'm going to speak a little bit later about the discerning safety from discomfort. It's all extremely discomforting. And yet, how do we prioritize the safety of the most vulnerable folks? If we track ethics, we're looking for vulnerability, you track vulnerability, and that's the person you need to be most accountable to. And we can't do that alone. It has to be collective accountability. It has to be structural, and it has to be multiple. So it's pretty complex work, but I just want to start by saying that these ideas of leaning in and trying to do justice with each other and stay with each other, to me, really come with educations from communities where we can't take our transgressions to the police or to social structures, because those are the structures that are oppressing us. So, you know, for the folks who believe that if you phone the police, their first thought is not your safety. Many of us, we can't leave it to social structures, which I would say are failed, and possibly flawed structurally. If we look at rape, for example, I would make a case that in Australia and Canada, rape is not even illegal. If you look statistically, it's just not even illegal, and yet that's where hundreds of millions of dollars have gone in historically to deliver nothing except trying to incarcerate particular men. As a feminist who's an intersectional feminist, you know, I'm not for the incarceration of anybody. I'm against the prison industrial complex. So using my activism as a feminist to incarcerate some men around rape is not the thing I'm looking for at all. So the last thing I want to do is involve the police in making repair. That's structure. That's just not a good tactic if you come from a justice doing kind of perspective. So we need to think about these communities, you know, in communities like refugee communities, communities of folks who are do not have status, things that our governments or our nation states call illegal people, with queer communities, transgender and non-binary communities. We can never, and direct action activists, we never give up on each other, because we can't, because we need each other. We need each other's solidarity profoundly. And so many people have taught me, not because I'm a worthy ally, but because they're just so desperate and so oppressed and having anyone in their court that's got access to some of the privilege I now have makes it worthwhile. So I just want to acknowledge with all humility that this is profoundly collaborative and complicated, but comes on the backs of particular folks. And always those educations elevate me and are at the cost of folks who are oppressed. So there's something that feels pretty dirty about that, and I think we just need to continually work towards justice so that that's not the case. But as things go in social justice, we know it's always folks in the margins who move things forward for the center. My work is always trying to be decolonizing and justice doing as a frame. And when I talk about justice doing frame, I'm talking about something so much more than anti-oppressive practice. If your goal is to not oppress people, it's a really low bar. I don't want to just not oppress people. I actually want to deliver justice. And, you know, as Paulo Freire said, Cheryl and I were talking about this on our walk, unapologetically, we are actually out to change the world. We're not out to help one suffering person get over their symptoms and feel better and respond better to capitalism and what's required in heteronormativity, right? We're actually out to change the structure so there's more room for all of us. It's a very different project. So in terms of justice doing as a frame, I need to say that my work is very much an imperfection project. And it's an imperfection project not so that I can, you know, be off the hook. It's an imperfection project because we cannot define social justice. And Noam Chomsky talks brilliantly about this. And Arundhati Roy speaks about the difference between social justice, which is a huge, expansive, beautiful, mutual delusion we're all imagining all the time, and ideas of human rights, which are more refined, winnable in court, and concrete. It's a much smaller project, and the things get flipped over, like so much gets prioritized now around human rights, and it's such a small piece of social justice. It's such an expansive idea. As well, so when I'm talking about trying to be decolonizing, I call it trying to be decolonizing because I am not decolonized. And I've been working on this, I'm 56. I've been working on this project a really long time, at least 3 decades. For the first 2 decades of my life, I didn't know I was on colonized territory. And I was lied to about that in something Jessica Yee talks about as educational violence. You know, it wasn't just an omission to not learn about whose territories we're on and whose ancestral lands we're on. It's more than that, right? It was also a political project of the vanishing savage, right? You know, once upon a time, there were people here in wigwams, and then they left, and then Cook came, and then we, you know, built, you know, Sydney or something. And we have similar origin myths in our colonizing nation states as well. So I'm trying to be decolonizing, and when I talk about decolonizing, there's some risks about that. I find a lot of folks have picked up activist language, and my job has always been to try to bridge the world of social justice activism with community work, with a broad range of community work. But in picking up language like decolonizing, a lot of folks I find don't even know what colonization means. So I think about it in terms of Gord Hill's analysis. He's an Indigenous warrior from Canada, Turtle Island, he would say. And Gord Hill talks about colonization as invasion, occupation, genocide, and assimilation. Invasion, occupation, genocide, and assimilation. So the reason that Canada and Australia are settler colonial countries is it's not like when we went to Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East where we want military bases and oil extraction and resource extraction. When our folks came here, we wanted this whole place. And so that's why Australia was called terris nullis, which means empty land. Canada had similar origin myths that were told, right? So the invasion came, but then the occupation. The point was to bring people and take all the land. As Kathy Richardson would say, Métis professor at the University of Montreal, you know, what was said to Indigenous people in Canada being First Nations people, Inuit people, Métis people, Two-Spirit people, move over, I want everything you're standing on. So they didn't just want the furs, they wanted everything. And to do that, after you invade and then occupy, you need genocide. And so genocide is not just about a huge massacre. Genocide is about getting rid of entire nations of people, and that's what that's what the Canadian government has done, and the Australian government, Aotearoa New Zealand, and the United States. What's useful for us in talking to each other is realizing this isn't just a couple of guys lost the plot. These are structures of colonial violence that are systemic, that are totally in line with the United Nations declarations against genocide, right? And so the last phase, invasion, occupation, genocide, and assimilation, everybody who's not killed in genocide, you assimilate. And one tactic of assimilation was the stolen generation in Australia, residential schools in Canada. Just the language of residential schools, where there was no education. And how do you call something a residential school when there's graveyards, right? And we know what's being exhumed in those graveyards are babies. And did all those babies die at birth? So like, you know, this ongoing genocide project. So yeah, residential schools were a piece of assimilation, one tactic of assimilation, but they actually are pieces of genocide. And we also know, you know, part of my first activism as a feminist was fighting for choice, birth control and access to abortion. At the same time, Indigenous women were being forcibly sterilized. You know, these are the tensions within us, so that colonization needs to be at, we have to understand colonization is at the root of violence on our territories, and that anytime we're trying to do social justice work, we need to root our work in decolonizing, which means being led by Indigenous people. So when I talk about being decolonizing, it's a different project for Indigenous or Aboriginal folks, for refugees or people who are required to come to these territories, or people who are immigrants who come as minoritized, racialized people, or people of color, or black people, all like that whole milieu and more, have a different accountability to the land than I have as a white settler because of things like white supremacy. So it's not like there's this binary of settlers and Aboriginal people. There's a mess. And so I'm trying to find my place in that and the protocols to be on the territories that I'm in. So when I talk about decolonizing, I'm being led by Indigenous people who are many Indigenous academics and activists who are calling for land return, Indigenous governance, and I would say as a direct action activist, we need to be led by Indigenous people. So that's what I'm trying to do when I talk about being decolonizing. In the work that we're doing together, in all of the different domains of practice that we have in community work, what we're really responding to is darkness and mean-filled politics, right? We are responding to suffering, human suffering, and we are not responding to the usual suspects, which is addiction, mental illness, and trauma. You know, where I live in Vancouver, I work a lot in the downtown east side. It's the poorest part of Canada that's not a First Nations reserve. We are being decimated by the opiate epidemic right now. It's an opiate epidemic, poisoning, political deaths. Because 4,000 people died last year and no one needed to die. That's why we're calling them political deaths. That's an accurate use of language. You know, what we need to do right now is treat this like a poisoning, decriminalize heroin, make it a prescription drug, give doctors the right to make a prescription for that, open enough supervised injection sites that people get their medication on site and are supervised as they should. No one needs to die. So, you know, the people I'm trying to shoulder up right now, led mostly by peers, the people we would call the first responders. Our government thinks the first responders are the police and the ambulance, but they're not. And the fire department. And I'm not saying they're not working hard in this. I'm saying the first responders are the peers. Other people are homeless, people living in tents, people keeping their friends alive. And so these folks, what they're responding to is political violence. And so when we call it the language of an opiate epidemic, it sounds like, you know, like a whole bunch of people who are drug addicts are making really bad choices, right? And it again, just takes us outside of the realm of politics, social injustice, and puts it back as if these folks are making individual bad decisions, which is what the usual suspects always do. Addiction, mental illness, and trauma. They always take us to the symptomology of the oppressed, and then the whole conversation happens in the landscape of the brain. And when you have a broken brain, then the weapon that you need to use, or the tool you need to use, is not to change anything about society, but fix that brain, right? But that's not where we're coming from. We're coming from the complexity, seeing the complexity of the world. And it is, as Paulo Freire says, it's our project to change the world. So as community workers who have an orientation to doing justice, we're not just trying to accommodate people to lives of oppression or survive oppression. We're also trying to work to change the context of oppression. That's why, as activists and many of the peers responding to the opiate epidemic poisoning, political killings. They're also opening illegal tents and pushing the health authorities so that the leadership is coming from the people, and then other folks are following. And that's okay, that's the way that's coming, because that's how change works. So in all of the, in all the contexts that we're dealing with of oppression, right? And we're responding to human suffering, one of the things that we need to do in order to have an orientation for justice doing in this work is to have an intersectional analysis and to move with both intersectionality and solidarity. And so the picture of this is Black Lives Matter in Vancouver, and these are women and non-binary folks who are speaking about the specificity of anti-Black racism in Canada. And this is really important because no one is saying that there isn't racism against other groups. They're saying there's something particular about anti-Black racism that's particularly tied to the state and to the state killings of, in particular, Black children, right, who are seen as terrorists or seen as threat, right? Islamophobia informs us that Muslim youth are seen as terrorists, right? Activists are sometimes seen as terrorists. And so what's interesting for me in terms of these non-binary and trans women and women from Black Lives Matters, there's a sign up behind them that says Black Lives Matter in solidarity with Apawapskat. Now that's a First Nations reserve that had multiple adolescent suicides. Now we know those are deaths by colonization and poverty and despair, right? And that those youth didn't take their own lives. We have an analysis about that. I talk about the fact that hate kills. People don't take their own lives. But the fact that Black Lives Matter is having a conversation just about the specificity of anti-Black racism, yet they're in solidarity with First Nations youth, just shows you that's that solidarity, that intersectionality. It's never just about one thing, right? It's about paying attention to power and oppression, however it's playing out. I think it's, one of the things I think is super important in terms of looking at intersectionality. If we look at, for example, if we look in the domain of gender, if we look at feminism, a feminism that is not attending to intersectionality can be an oppressive force, right? As punks say, any tool is a weapon if you hold it right, And so feminism can be used, in ways that actually are not in line with feminist values at all. One thing I acknowledge as a white woman, where I live in Vancouver, is I am safer as a white woman, even a woman who's been working class, and I've been a victim of men's violence and sexualized violence in community, at risk out in the community. But I am safer than any Aboriginal man in Vancouver. And that's a feminist position, right? That's what it is to really understand intersectionality. And when Black Lives Matter say Black Lives Matter, and there's a response that says all lives matter, that's backlash. That's what that is. And we know, and it is a teaching from Feminism 101, right? That when you speak truth to power, you will get kicked in the teeth. And we have to stand up alongside each other in solidarity and answer back to that. So it's not that all lives don't matter. And the picture I have is of a very angry Black woman. And I had some women from Black Lives Matter in Rochester come up to me. I was teaching with Ken Hardy. And they came up to me and they thanked me for putting up a picture of an angry Black woman and not apologizing for her anger. And I just shake when I think about that because, if we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about feminism, which women, and then how women are allowed to resist. I'm allowed to get angrier as a white woman than a Black woman's allowed to get, and yet it's Black children who are being shot by cops. So whose rage must be outed in terms of an ethical orientation to out your rage, right? I also think about in Canada, we have the National Inquiry into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The whole world is paying attention to Canada on this issue. And these are women who are at risk because they're Indigenous, because they're Aboriginal, because they're poor. And we can directly tie these deaths to colonization. It's because of the breakdown of culture. It's because Indigenous women have been taken off their territories and have to come to urban sites. This is why they're more likely to be involved in sex work. and the impoverishment of those communities. So, you know, it's never just, that intersectionality is, it's never just, oh yeah, Aboriginal women, they die more than other folks. Yes, they do, but it's because they're off their land. It's connected to genocide, not just racism. It's connected to way more than colonization, right? It's not just sexism. And there's a particularity to the ways that violence and oppression work that perpetrators understand very well, and we sometimes as activists are not as informed by. There's a lovely quote from JB, the First Lady. She's a First Nations woman and hip hop artist. And she says, if you don't respect my existence, expect my resistance. And I love that because I believe what I've been taught as an activist, but then again by all of the survivors of torture that I've worked with, that whenever people are oppressed, they resist. And they resist with everything that they have. And sometimes psychology can take every act of resistance a person has and turn it into a symptom of trauma, or a symptom of mental illness, or a symptom of addiction. But actually the person is fighting back with what they've got, and communal groups fight back communally, right? So I'm very informed by her. I like hearing her saying some of the stuff that I say, but also what I've been taught by survivors of torture and by everyone that I've ever seen who's been oppressed, that people always resist their oppression. And that resistance is often not enough to stop oppression, but it's important because of its ability to keep us connected to the human project for social justice that we're all oriented with. What's really required now is a true reckoning with power. And when I talk about a true reckoning with power, I'm talking about the power that we hold in social justice movements, not just the structural power that we're trying to dismantle and transform. What are the accountability structures that we have within our movements and our organizations? And how are we responsive to cultural consultants? Who are you answering to for your work? Who is informing you? And how are you being directed? So like I said, in terms of decolonizing practice, that means being led by the people of the land. And so what are the protocols for that? How do we do that? Because those are only mysteries to settlers. Those aren't mysteries to the people of the land. And so, and that true reckoning of power has me thinking continually as an activist, what is my access to power in this moment with this person? You know, and how do I be accountable? And what is it that's going on in this moment? Where am I required to have accountability? Who am I going to be collectively accountable to? And who are the people who are standing with me? It's not an individual project. It's a collective project. I think about the peers who are the people responding as the first responders in the opiate epidemic, poisonings, and political deaths in Vancouver. And I think about their responses. How do we keep everything that's happening in response to that epidemic and those deaths accountable to those peers? Because they're the people who are keeping most of the people alive. Sally St. George and Dan Wolfe talk about practice as research. That it's we don't do research in a lab. We're doing our practice with people all the time. And what I know about the opiate epidemic is that all of the research about best practice and what should happen is on the backs of peers. They figure it out. That's how we found out initially that if you're going to give someone mouth to mouth with a plastic mask, when they throw up, that is going to come into your mouth. You need to know that ahead of time. And you do know that ahead of time because peers told each other this is what's going to happen. And then we got better masks, right? So the research is happening on the ground all the time, and it's being led by the peers, not by the universities. Quite ingenuinely, our Prime Minister asked for more research on this. I've been part of Insight, the first supervised injection site in North America in the downtown east side of Vancouver. At one point I supervised the therapists there, the drug and alcohol counselors there. It's been open for 14 years and no one has died of an overdose there. So that's all the research that we need. That's called catalytic validity, right? That research is important for what it can deliver, not what it can measure. What kind of difference does it make? Not how do you, not how do you count it or replicate it, right? So for academics to take $1 to study the efficacy of something that's for 14 years proved itself unmessable. It's interesting, right? Because how come that same scrutiny isn't being taken to the police around rape? Because then we would probably decide all that money's better spent giving it to rape crisis centers and accountable men's groups, non-binary folks struggling with stuff. You know, it's just interesting when the questions come and when the questions are silenced, right? So when we're talking about a reckoning with power, it's attending to all of that. You know, when we abuse power with the folks that we're trying to see, we're not re-traumatizing them, we're traumatizing them, if we're going to use the messy language of trauma. I myself prefer the language of oppression and violence. I think about safety as consistency and predictability across time, and that's also what's required for our relationships with each other. And you know, I'm thinking about the women that I work with, you know, at a rape crisis center. Women are intelligent, and they care about what we do, not what we say. So, you know, at a rape crisis center, women coming in, and I'm talking about trans women, non-binary folks, and women, you can't tell them that they're safe here. You have to do safety. And they're watching how we treat each other. So if we're replicating a politics of oppression with each other, you know, women who've been oppressed are finally attuned to power. They know a lot more about power than a lot of people think they do. And they're going to decide to not trust us, not because they're pre-contemplative or not ready to make change, but because we've transgressed against trust, right? And psychology always, and the social services, the helping professions, always gives us a language to blame clients or the people we're trying to serve every time we fail them. We can always say they're not ready, they're pre-contemplative, like we've got tons of, and that to me is violent language. Yeah, I'm worried about people swearing, well, not really much. I'm very working class. Swearing at someone, directed swearing is a problem, using racist language is a problem, but using the neutral, powerful, power over oppressive language of psychology, addiction, and mental illness on people it bothers me a lot more because it's one of the things that goes just smoothly in polite professional conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about how is it that we stay with each other when it gets really hard and we disagree strongly with each other, when our tactics we don't agree on similar tactics, when we have very different ideas about how to do things. One of the things I remind myself is nobody came into this work to hurt people. That's just an assumption. That's a useful assumption I come from. Because if I don't come from there, I can go to really dark places of evaluating and judging other people's intentions. And I just find it's not useful. So I just assume everybody came to this work to help. And I know that people lose the plot. Sometimes people get enmeshed and they, you know, do heroic posturing and want to save people and work as lone wolves and they can get places closed down. Sometimes people get disconnected and they get with massive negativity and cynicism, and which I believe is bullying in our sector because we all talk a good game. No one's going to call me fat and ugly. They're just going to be massively cynical and make every meeting not work, you know, and that is bullying, right? So I know people lose the plot, but how do we bring people back to the center, to connection? We need to create a culture of critique with each other to bring each other back to connection, because you cannot keep yourself ethical in this work. You know, so when we're with connection, when we're in that zone of fabulousness, where we're not enmeshed and we're not disconnected, but we're fabulous, you know, because there's times we're fabulous. We're walking our talk, as activists say, and we're enacting our ethics, and we're alongside each other in solidarity, but we're also imperfect as we do this. And so when I do something that's transphobic, misgendering somebody, you know, just replicating cis normativity because it's where I live, in my meetings with the Transgender Free Clinic, I need someone to bring me back. It's a sign of respect to bring me back, right? Because you cannot keep yourself fabulous, right? So if what we've got to talk about our differences with each other is just calling out, we're going to be in real trouble. And in some activist communities right now, we're really captured by a calling out culture. I'm not against calling out as a tactic. Black Lives Matter has shut down Mr. Trump in the United States, and so they should. When you're talking to people who are absolutely standing up for fascist politics, you should not dialogue with them. It is a bad tactic, right? When the white supremacists marched in the United States, really, what black people have said to me is the Ku Klux Klan is marching without their masks. That's a very terrifying thing. When that happens, you don't have a dialogue with those people. Of course, all the, quote, progressive medias interviewed them and gave them a lot of airtime to talk about who they were. I think it's a bad tactic. I think we should shut those guys down, right? So it's not that I'm against calling out and shutting down, but it's not the thing you do with your allies. It's not the thing you do with your potential allies. And it is unethical to do this with your coworkers, because your coworkers are still seeing clients. So you ethically owe it to clients of the present and the future to lean in and have a tough conversation with people who you may find despicable. But that's not that doesn't really matter. What matters is, if we track vulnerability in ethics, you're not the most vulnerable person as a coworker. It's the people that they're going to serve, right? So, one of the things we know is, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if every time someone does something that's not right, you're going to hammer them and call them out, we're really going to be divisive, and we're going to lose people in social movements, right? So I think we need to be, calling out has strategic uses and yet limitations. We have to have a robust critique about all of our tactics. But I also think, in terms of direct action, this is where I get this from, direct action activists, we get critiqued all the time for the things that we do. For example, in fighting the Olympics in Vancouver, 2010, the Hudson's Bay window of a store of Hudson's Bay, which is the Frontier store. They used to be the outpost that did the beaver trades. Hudson's Bay is a colonizing corporation. So a window was broken of theirs in a direct action. The action was called clogging the arteries of capitalism. So you knew, don't bring your kids. It said, not a family event, okay? And then everybody said, oh my God, they broke a window, right? But Harriet Nahaney, an Indigenous elder, died in police custody. She was fighting Eagle Ridge. She was fighting to save some territory that they cleared off to build something for the Olympics. And during that protest and the police taking her away, putting her in jail, where I believe that she was put in with white women in jail as an elder. She was a residential school survivor and an elder. And she got harmed and was seriously ill. They got her out of jail just in time to die in hospital. But there was no outcry about Harriet Nahaney's death. People were really pissed off about a window. And I'm talking about social justice activists. Most of them didn't even know Harriet Nahaney died, right? But they did know this window was broken. And, someone I have great respect for in the movement said, okay, let's look at the tactic of breaking a window, but can we look at the tactic of yet another candlelight vigil? So when you have another silent candlelight vigil that causes no disruption, and the police aren't even moved by it, and it doesn't do much in terms of changing direct responses to it. I'm not saying never have a candlelight vigil. I'm like, if everything has to be a candlelight vigil, we're not shifting much, right? So I would like there to be as much scrutiny of each action, right? The same as I want all of my actions kind of scrutinized as well. So there's real consequences for calling out cultures. Activists have left movements, and we're replicating a politics in our movements for social justice that we don't want, right? In particular, patriarchy and abuses of power. If we're using control and domination, it doesn't matter if we're calling ourselves feminists or if we're located within feminine bodies. If what we're doing is domination and control, what we are enacting is patriarchy. And patriarchy can be enacted by any gender, right? As can feminism. It's not gender that makes what you're doing feminist. It's whether or not it's actually in line with delivering a just society. But Frances Lee wrote a paper about the consequences of calling out and put it up in 2017 saying, I started to fear my own comrades. I spent enormous amounts of energy protecting my activist identity from attack. And that's exhausting to think about and quite heartbreaking as well, right? And in response to that calling out, there was a move. Some of this showed up on Black Girl Dangerous. That's a brilliant blog. If you don't read it, I learn a lot from that blog. Talking about calling in. And calling in is different than calling out, right? Calling in, again, this person's who's written this is saying, this post is specifically about us calling in people who we want to be in community with, people who we have reason to trust or with whom we have a common ground. It's not a free-for-all for those with privilege to demand we put their hurt feelings first, regardless of the harm they cause. So calling in isn't for everybody. It's for the folks it's really worth teaching. It's for the folks who are in it for the long haul, right? And I think calling in was a great response to calling out, but that's not what I'm talking about for us. I'm talking about backing up the truck even further. And so I'm talking about leaning in. And I published an article called Leaning In as Imperfect Allies in Community Work. And John Winslade edited that and made it a much better article. But what I'm talking about in terms of leaning in, how that's different than calling in, is we are required in the helping professions to create relationships of respect and dignity with each other before we have a need to talk to each other about an invitation to accountability. And that's the work, that's the hard work we haven't done. So often when I go into teams for team days, people are like, we want a kayak, or they think they're gonna do something where let's find how many people have 6 siblings and find someone else who's a Pisces. And I'm like, no, we're not doing none of that stuff, right? We're gonna do the hard work of finding sites of respect and dignity with each person you work with, right? I don't care if people like each other. I actually don't even think it's a great idea, because sometimes liking each other moves teams to be staff-centered teams as opposed to client-centered teams, and we smooth over difference because we're prioritizing harmonious relationships amongst us over legitimate and just relationships with clients, right? So liking each other, do it, but it's not neutral either, right? But what I want is to create relationships of respect and dignity. So that's what I'm talking about, looking for and connecting to the ethics of the other and inviting that collective responsibility, right? What I know is if someone gets hurt in a place that I'm working at, if someone's disrespected where I'm working, that is on me, collectively. I was working at a place where a woman came in, she was homeless and had a big raincoat on, and she smelled really bad because she's homeless. And she was walking really slow, her feet probably are tender and sore, right? And she had walked out of the downtown east side, so I don't know how she found us, and came into a center, feminist center, a rape crisis center. And I noticed her in the lobby, and then I was walking somewhere else in another minute, and I saw her shuffling as quickly as she could away through the window. And I just felt this spiritual pain of what had happened to this woman. And so I left the rape crisis center. And I also know, I'm not that tall, but I'm kind of big. And I'm like, I can't chase after her. She doesn't need a big woman, big person, big white person chasing after her, right? So I had to run ahead of her and then walk backwards, right? So I'm walking towards her, and she looked devastated. And I said, what happened there? I'm from the center, what happened there? And she looked at me and she said, I will never be spoken to like that again. I'll never be treated like that again. And so, the first thing I'm given to do, because I'm Canadian, we're all about the politics of politeness, and we're about blame and accusation, all these unuseful things. The first thing I wanted to ask, well, who said that to you? Did you get their name? What was their hair like? Let's figure out which one of these girls to do, you know what I mean? But I resisted that, which is the individualization of blame, right? And moved in instead in solidarity and said, please give us another try. And took collective accountability. I'm so sorry that we harmed you. That is not okay. Can I take you back and get you some help? So she was courageous enough, imagine what it took for her to return after being treated in such a disparaging way. And so she walked back in with me, and I grabbed the first person at the door and I said, look, can you take this woman, take Kathy, she was just treated terribly here. I don't know what happened, but she really needs help. Later that afternoon, we had the clinical supervision meeting, and I said, what happened? Did anybody catch what happened there? Between us, we couldn't figure it out. No one remembered saying anything. What I think happened is because of the way she smelled, because we're in a rainforest and she's wearing a rubberized thing, I think somebody might have gone like this, in their own way, thinking unintentionally, and that's massive stigma and judgment. And so it may well have been that. And so what we need to look at in terms of those multiple, so remember what I said about where are your cultural accountabilities? We've done a lot of work in that feminist community to be accountable to Aboriginal women, to other Indigenous women, to trans women and non-binary women. We were doing a lot of work, but we haven't worked well enough with poor women and homeless women. And we needed to take a look at how we got to a place where we oppressed that woman, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about leaning in. So when I talk about this as an anti-perfection project, one of the reasons it's an anti-perfection project is when we see oppression, we respond with action. And then we're going to reflect on it, and then we're going to learn something and have better actions, or we're going to have to do the hard work of repair. And we might have to do all those things, right? But we're not going to see someone being oppressed, like where I live in East Van with a lot of homeless people on the street. When I see the police, and we have so many secret police squads. There's the neighborhood watch. There's the, they've got the new, everybody gets a raincoat in Vancouver, the red ones, the yellow ones. So there's all these squads from the Chamber of Commerce, like the ambassadors of love, or what, neighborhood ambassadors. But they're harassing homeless people. We know what they're doing is clean poor people off the street. When we see a couple of those folks, even walking towards folks who are homeless, we just respond immediately. I just go right in and say, "Oh, officer, what's your name?" And then I get their name. And I'm like, "Has something happened to Dance? Dance, because someone assaulted him last week, and the other week someone stole his stuff. We called you guys, you didn't even come. But anyway, has something happened to him now?" So I interject with my privilege as a white housed person. I don't swear, and I cover my tattoos as best I can. I try to look like someone the police would see as a legitimate citizen. And then from that power, I lean in and situate Dance as a person who's most likely to be the victim of crime, definitely not a perpetrator of crime. And it usually just shifts stuff up, right? I mean, immediately, "Oh yeah, no, just making sure he was okay." I'm like, "Sure, dude, okay." And then afterwards, I reflect with Dance, and I'm like, "Is that okay?" And sometimes he's like, "No, look, Vikki, I don't need you to do that for me. I can talk for myself. I had that one, right?" And then there I've been patronizing. And so you can't have a tactic. "Oh, this is what I do when the establishment is attacking a homeless person." It has to be, in this moment, what's the response? So I need to look at Dance as a human being and say, "Do you want me in? Do you want me to back off?" We need to negotiate this in the moment. It's going to be imperfect. Then I need to apologize, make repair, and get a wider repertoire for my acts of resistance and how I'm going to back folks up, right, in the future. So, we're not going to get it right. And when we try to get it right as activists, we get paralyzed and we don't act. And the important part of being an activist is the word action, like to take action, right? So what I'm talking about a lot is collective accountability. That collective accountability that makes it everybody's business that someone on my street is being harassed for being homeless, right? It's on all of us. And the people who walk by and work very hard to not be able to see a homeless person. That's a lot of work you have to do to make yourself continually not see human beings. They're also collectively accountable. They're part of this scenario as well. How do I bring them into vision? Like, how do I invite their accountability as well? So, when I think about collective accountability, I'm informed by Richard Day. He's an anarchist who's a professor at Queen's University, I believe, in Ontario. And he talks about groundless solidarity and infinite responsibility. These teachings, I just couldn't do much of my work without this teaching. It's from him, but it's from anarchists. It's from anarchist theory, but direct action activism. Groundless solidarity means it's never just about gender. It's never just about race. It's never just about class. In fact, when I was having that clinical supervision at the Rape Crisis Center where we had oppressed that woman who was homeless, one person, well-meaning, said, "Maybe she smells so bad, hygiene is a real sign of depression, And I was like, "Have you been to a shelter?" Because most women don't shower at shelters. First of all, they don't have showers. And then to go public places where you find showers, many women have been attacked and brutalized in shelters, or all their clothing and stuff stolen or raped and assaulted in showers. So not having a shower is not necessary. You can't decide the meaning of that is bad hygiene, and this is a symptom of depression. You see how that usual suspect stuff get us right off the hook. Now, that, in terms of groundless solidarity and infinite responsibility, there we were, this person was even trying to be accountable to the fact that it was a homeless woman, right? But was replicating a politics of blame, right? And a politics of trying to continually diagnose homeless folks as mentally ill so that it somehow becomes something that's happening in their brain as opposed to in the social world. So that groundless solidarity is that it's never just about one thing. And infinite responsibility is the idea that I always have to be open to the fact of who am I not in perfect solidarity with in this moment. And when I talk about these things, people find it pretty exhausting. And my response is the alternative is being okay with being racist, right? So I think we've signed up for this, right? Now, Aaron Monroe, who's a trans guy that works in housing with me, we've worked on a lot of projects together. He said something beautiful when we were teaching together last year. He said, "You don't fight oppression with oppression. You don't fight oppression with oppression." And so one of the things I think about is, I know from social justice activism that we need to be replicating the world we want in the ways that we organize. if I'm using domination and control in how I'm bullying other people as activists, then what I'm going to deliver is the society we're already in, right? I need to do justice with people as we're moving towards the world we want, right? Because what we have to be creating a liberatory space where we're enacting the politics that we want. So in terms of resisting calling out, how do we move to critique? You know, how do we offer critique and feedback in a way that it's not attack? Because like I said, any tool is a weapon if you hold it right. And many folks have been in work situations where people use all the right language, because let's face it, our sector knows how to talk. We're those people, right? And so, oh, Vikki, can I offer you a critique? Okay, I just wanted to say in front of everybody publicly right now that I saw you be very rude to Jim last week. I thought it broke my heart, actually. Because I know you say that you're all about justice, and I can't imagine how terrible his day was. Really, I don't know how we could ever, it was just terrible. I'm like, oh, thanks. So you couldn't have talked to me when it happened. You couldn't have talked to me alone anytime between now and this week when we're having a meeting and my manager's here. You know, that's an attack, right? And then, of course, what I'm going to respond with is, well, shithead, you know, I think you left the sink full of dishes. So now we've got a counterattack, right? I won't say that. I'll say something also equally skilled, right? Yeah. But we know what's happening. It's shit talk, right? It's garbage talk, right? It's attack, counterattack. There's nothing in that that's critique. So one of the conversations that we have to have is a conversation about what is critique and what is attack, and make sure we can discern those things, right? And so that we're not replicating attack when what we're trying to do is lean in and offer someone a critique to bring them back to the fabulous, to bring them back to the ethics they've lost track of, right? So fostering cultures of critique and cultures of accountability. I've written about this for the helping professions in an article called Centering Ethics in Group Supervision, Structuring Safety and Creating Cultures of Critique. And David Denborough edited that article brilliantly and made that a better article, so God bless the editors. So in terms of fostering cultures of critique and cultures of accountability, what I'm looking for are intentional, accountable relationships. We don't just fall into relationships that are going to deliver a critique. You know, when I go into teams, I always ask everybody when I teach, how many people here want a rigorous critique of what they're doing? Everybody's hungry for it. Who feels they can give it immediately, gracefully, in a useful way on the spot? Not many of us, right? And so it's interesting, critique is a gift you give the other person to bring them back to ethics, to bring them to a collective accountability. It's lateral mentoring, as Nancy Arthur would say. This is the way we actually bring each other up, isn't it? And what's required for that are respect-filled, dignifying relationships. Not friendships, not your team going out curling on Thursday nights. That's a very Canadian thing. But how do we start to foster those relationships? We need to start with our collective ethics. So we're really going to back up the truck. I need to know why you are here. And I need to know this about everybody on my team. What is at the heart of your work? What are the ethics that drew you here? And what ways in the work do you value and hold close? Maybe even sacred. For me, I would say dignity doing. If I think what we're doing is undignified, I just can't tolerate it. I will not be able to stay. I'll try to change the organization, I'll do things, but eventually I just won't be able to be there because I know I can't stay well in that. And what ethics are required for your work without which you'd be unable to work, right? I need to know that about everybody. I don't need to know where you went to school, what your degrees are, any of that. I really don't. What other jobs you had and stuff. And then we need to do the hard work of fostering relationships of respect and dignity. So then I need to know, what do we need to understand in order to respect you, to make space for you, and to not transgress against you in our relationship? For example, I let folks know my family of choice is queer, trans, and non-binary. You know, and our extended, I guess our grandbabies, to use a heteronormative word, but we're the silly people to these young ones. That's their official term for us. It means grandparents in a queer, non-binary family. Folks should know that about me when I'm supervising them, because I have power, right, in that relationship. And then if someone says something that's transphobic, I'm going to lose my ever-loving straight mind, right? And people should know that's just at the heart. That's just it'll hurt me in a way. It'll be very hard to repair, right? So I think we have to take some risks because, there's a parallel ethic involved, right? Clients and families we work with are always put at risk to be vulnerable and show us who they are. And yet we hide behind professionalism and good boundaries to never disclose who we are. And yet all clients tell us They want to know they're in front of a human being. And more so, folks from exploited and marginalized locations want to see themselves reflected in the people who help them. We know that, right? So why are we continually hiding behind this white, there's nothing, nobody here. You know, it's like the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to that guy behind the curtain, right? So I want to know what you hold sacred, close to your heart, that it would be useful and important for us to know. Now, I want to hold this alongside attention. I'm not trying to out everybody about all of their locations, but given the relative safety that we have and our commitments to create safe, critical relationships with each other, relationships that can flow to critique, we're required to show up in some ways, right? So that's not a binary there. So what I believe strongly is, if our work is ethical, we can have sustainability in the work. And like if I look at the opiate epidemic right now, it's heartbreaking and people are dying. I was here with Tara Danger last year. Tara Taylor was managing the largest social housing project in Vancouver at the time. And every morning I got up and did yoga, and Tara got up and put her phone on to find out who died the night before. And that's a really different way to start your day, And with all of those folks that are dying, it's easy to think that people are just going to burn out, but that's not all that's happening. Because a lot of peers, I spent the New Year's Day with peers at what used to be the illegal tent of the supervised injection site. These folks just put up a tent because they weren't waiting for the government and the health authority to do something. And so I guess I volunteered. Part of my activism, I go spend time, I guess you'd say, supervising that team. And it was New Year's Day, and what a great way to start the year. So none of us got wasted the night before. New Year's is a kind of a big party in Canada, so I didn't do that. And neither did they. And so I was sitting with about 20 people, and I was asking them, how are you staying alive in this? How dark is it getting for you? Has this got you thinking about not being around here? What's going on? These kind of, as Imelda McCarthy and No Leg Burn, the Irish team, would say, questions in the margins, questions way out here, right? And this one guy said, Dr. Reynolds, because they're all so appreciative of me just showing up, you know what I mean? That power, and letting me know that he's aware of power, even though I'm pretending it's not. But you don't get to abdicate your power, Dr. Reynolds. I know you're really worried we're going to burn out. He goes, you're worried about, you're a drug and alcohol counselor, so you're worried that I'm going to relapse and use heroin again. He goes, let me tell you, last year, I believe this man said that he had overturned 80 deaths last year. 80 people where he gave them CPR and Narcaned them and was able to bring them back to life 80 times. And he said to me, I was using heroin real heavily 2 years ago, and this has transformed me. And he goes, I won't be using this year. There's no chance I'm going back because there's 80 people's lives I'm going to save this year. I owe it to these 80 people to not use. So I just feel energy come right through me when I heard that. It's like, there's these stories about this, that this work is going to break our hearts and burn us out. And then there's this story about vicarious resistance and how it sets you on fire, right? For this guy, sustainability was the fact that what he was doing was so ethical. And it wasn't just sustaining him, it was helping him stay away from heroin. Not because he was afraid to die, because he was required to keep other people alive, right? So, but if we think what we're doing is unethical, then I think what we're in front of is spiritual pain. And yoga won't get you out of that, neither will drinking water, right? Like that spiritual pain that says, or an ethical pain that says, here's my ethics, but what I'm doing is not on board with this. You can't tolerate that. But the only way to stay ethical is if someone is offering you a critique. I know from doing clinical supervision, what people need to bring is the gaps in the work, but they're gaps so you don't see them. That's, by definition, a gap is something that you don't see. So you can't go to supervision and say, I think I'm not that great with homeless people. I think when people really smell, I think I might respond badly. Nobody knew that, right? So we have to offer each other a critique in the moment. It's not something you can go and take to supervision. So what I talk to people about is, I need to know that people understand we've built relationships of respect and dignity. We understand the collective ethics that people are there for, right? We've had a conversation about discerning critique from attack, and now we have to do the hard work of critique. And it starts by, how do you let me know you're open to critique? How do you invite critique? Everybody says they're open to it, so saying you're open to it is just bullshit. Because someone said, everybody has said they're open to it, and then you say, oh, Vikki, can I tell you about something? And I'm like, yeah, no, yeah, bring it. I'm kind of busy though. Right? And everything I'm doing is letting you know that this isn't, that I'm not open to this, right? How, you know, so we need to know, how do you let people know that you're open to critique, right? And what practices assist you in receiving critique? How would you like to be given critique? So I model this first with my team. This is a conversation I want to have with everybody. So what I say is, you know what? I would like to know second. I know you have, I'm usually the clinical supervisor or the professor or whatever. So I know I have more power, and I'm white the whole time. So, you know, so I know that I have more power. So it's reasonable that someone, if they have to tell me something about racism or transphobia or something, or I've disrespected a sex worker, you know, someone's got to talk to someone else and say, okay, so Reynolds talks a good game. Is she full of shit, or does she walk or talk? No, man, I had to talk about something last year and it went okay. Okay, cool. That's a solidarity conversation. This is witness versus gossip. You have to have a conversation about witness versus gossip. Like, well, I think she's okay, but let's talk to Susie. Susie, what do you think about Vikki? Da, da, da. So now we're doing gossip, right? So when is it witness and when is it gossip? If you're having a conversation because you're trying to figure out if it's client-centered and you're trying to help me be ethical, then it's witness. But as soon as it's gossip and it's not required to have the client at the center, then we're doing this other thing, right? So in terms of what assists you in receiving critique, I want to hear it. I want to be the next person to hear it. And the other thing is, I would like to hear it quick. And don't lie to me. Please be genuine. That's the kind of relationships I want to create. Honorable relationships. Because if we're friendly, I might smooth over us not getting along because you saw me do something disrespectful to Jim. But we're not being friendly. We're being client-centered. If the client's at the center, you're going to tell me. So when I say, look, are we okay with each other? And you're like, oh yeah, no, we're fine. But we're not fine? I will know. So will everybody in this room, right? We're relational people. It's what we do. So don't lie to me and tell me we're fine when we're not. But it might be because of power or not figuring out how to say it. You might say, we're not cool, but I can't talk to you right now. I'm like, that's cool. Take some time. But tell me before we leave today. It is not okay, and it's not client-centered, to let someone hang overnight. That doesn't serve clients. That person is then going to go talk to other people, and they're not going to sleep. And they're going to talk to their partner, who already thinks their work is too damn hard and wants them to go back to lifeguarding, right? Because there's no way they can fix this, right? So be honorable and have the moral courage to give that critique that day. I would like to get critique private, if it's possible, but when the transgression is public, the repair has to be public. You know, so if at the beginning of a supervision group, I call my groups supervision of solidarity groups, but at the beginning of a solidarity group, if someone comes in and says, oh, sorry, I'm late, I was, you know, cut off by a Chinese driver, and of course they wouldn't use the word Chinese. Racism against Asian people is rampant in Vancouver. But someone starts like that, you know what? You don't get to take them aside and say, hey, Vikki, you know, that was really, you know, I'm sure that's not how you really wanted to say it. Maybe you weren't thinking much, but that was really racist. You can't do that because everybody heard it. And so the repair has to be public, not just about racism, about all of it. If we're okay with racism, it's not a safe place for trans folks. If it's not a safe place for trans folks, it's not okay for a single mom, right? Like, you know, oppression, you got to take it on all fronts. So if someone does that, I need to say, hey, man, that might not be how you wanted to say that. Straight up, that was racist. That's exactly how I do that. And then like, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I said, I know, shitty way to start our solidarity group, but hey, we're doing critique. So that's safe. I hope we're good. And I mean that, but we're going to say these things out loud with each other, right? So the other thing is, how would you offer critique? And what are your intentions behind offering critique in these ways? I want people to know if there's something wrong with us, I'm going to tell you immediately. I'm going to tell you in private if I can. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to do it in public if it's a public transgression. I don't want anybody walking around on eggshells around me because I have more power, wondering, are we okay? Are we not okay? Are we okay? Right? One thing I sometimes say is I have 27 years of school and I cannot read brains. I missed that course. You probably did too. We spend so much time in the helping profession trying to read each other's brains, and we're not good at it, people. So we should surrender on that one. You know, step one, surrender. You are powerless over that. And what we need to do is just straight up say it, right? So if things are not cool, I will let you know, and I want you to trust that I will do that. You need to know that I'm client-centered enough that I will not prioritize us being in harmony over you doing justice. I'll help you, right? And yeah, my hope is that I want to guard people's dignity. I don't want to shame anybody, right? But I'm also going to help us be client-centered because that's what's required to be ethical, and that's what's going to keep us alive in the work. So I think the things we really need to do is that resisting smoothing over discomfort. And America Braca talks about not trying to annihilate the differences between us. We don't want to annihilate our differences. We need to keep those important differences, right? And there's a potential value of discord. There's something useful in us thinking different things. In fact, the last thing I want to hire is another 50-something-year-old woman with a lot of tattoos and no kids. We got that, because I'm there. I want difference, but that means we're going to bump into each other, right? And if we have a more bumping into each other culture, a culture of critique amongst us, we're going to come up with more options for serving families. If everybody thinks like me, I can tell you what the option's going to be. There's no sense meeting, right? So we got to resist that politics of politeness. And I've had such a fabulous welcome in Australia. Everybody's wonderful. And it scares me because the same thing's going on in Canada. We're so polite. You know, in group work, people won't offer something useful to another group member if they don't remember their name, because they'd rather not be useful to you than dare risk saying your name wrong. That politics of politeness. So what I always make public that I'm sorry, I forgot your name, I'm so sorry. And then I try to say people's names all the time. Just make public the repair. And what we're doing, as Nancy Arthur says in terms of lateral mentoring, is just making public, look, we have structures to be accountable. It's okay if you're not perfect here, right? We also have to resist discomfort. Barbara Herron talks about double comfort, being when you name privilege and then you don't do anything to be accountable to it. So I acknowledge I'm a white person and I'd be white over the whole meeting, you know, take over all the space, you know, that kind of stuff. But really interested in Kumashiro's teachings about discomfort. That discomfort is predictable and possibly necessary in anti-oppression education. This ties directly for me with that parallel ethic of wanting to be up to doing the things we ask families to do. Virginia Satir says in family work, we take a family and we throw it up in the air, right? And we throw it up in the air so that nothing can land the way it was before. We discomfort families. And yet I find the thing most intransigent to change is staff teams. They don't want to change. And it's like we are in the change business. And change is discomforting. You have to be discomforted in order to actually deliver change, right? So we have to be up to doing the things that we're asking families to do, right? And I think about having the moral courage to speak truth to power. That's actually what's called for. You know, sometimes folks, I think that I am a woman who has like ovaries of steel, that it's all just easy for me to, you know, say stuff. It isn't. I was brought up to be a very good, polite Irish Catholic girl. And I was very schooled in the politics of politeness. And speaking truth to power, I do it. And sometimes, you know, I was given a huge keynote this year to 500 feminist folks. And I stopped halfway and said, I don't know how you guys are doing, but my committee of assholes just showed up. And everybody started laughing because I'm probably not the only person who has a committee of assholes, right? So the committee of assholes shows up, and usually it's saying the same things, which is little girls should be seen and not heard. And then it says things that are meaner, you know? But it's always a man's voice. It's a bunch of men's voices, not one in particular. And it's all about, you know, that boys are what they do and girls are what they look like, you know. But the whole point is for me to take less space. And it happens when I'm speaking truth to power. So when I talk about moral courage, it's like defying that committee of assholes. And it's not, you know, I don't think of those as internal voices. You know, those are voices that get stuffed down people's throats, right? That is from the social world. It's a social construction, right? So that moral courage in speaking truth to power isn't something some people are gifted with. It is hard work. And it comes to me from activism. That's when I found my voice, is when I was with people who were rising up and speaking truth to power. And the other thing we got to think about in this is many folks find it very hard to offer critique because they use a language of being unsafe. Now, I'm not saying that some people are not unsafe at work. Some people are unsafe at work. But if you're unsafe with your coworker, it's an issue of supervision, and your organization needs to deal with that. if so someone comes to me and they're like, oh, Vikki, I want to talk to you about Julie. I can't. And I'm like, have you talked to Julie? And like, no, I can't talk to Julie because I feel unsafe with Julie. And I'm like unsafe, like you have 911 on the speed dial, unsafe. Because I'm the clinical supervisor, and now you're reporting your coworker saying that they're unsafe. Oh, I didn't mean to report them. It's like, no, but you did, right? Like, make power transparent. We're not just two people meeting for a coffee when you're talking to the clinical supervisor about another worker. And then people sometimes use the word, I find them intimidating. And I'm like, intimidating is a word that means things. So if you're saying someone's intimidating, it actually means a breach of power. And then I'm asking for specifics in terms of behavior. So what has this person said or done that's an abuse of power? Oh, you don't have to get so heavy. I didn't mean that. I just mean, it's just how I feel. And I'm like, oh, no. No, we're not talking about your feelings, right? You're reporting somebody, so it's about what they said or did, not what you feel about it. And cleaning up our talk. Because one of the things that we sometimes do on teams, and supervisors don't do this well sometimes, is we start to treat our coworkers like clients. And supervisors start to treat their teams as if it's a family that they're supervising, and that's very dangerous, right? And so we need to clean up those practices and clean up that language, right? So I think what's required is thinking about the differences between what's discomforting and what's unsafe, that they're very different things, right? How is discomfort different from being unsafe? How do you tell the difference? How do you respond when you're unsafe? And how do you respond when you're discomforted? They're very different things, right? And how can you tolerate or even use discomfort to be more useful and accountable? Because that spiritual pain, when I do something that is transphobic, I feel that spiritual pain. My body is my resource. And so feeling that pain, the last thing I want to do as a clinical supervisor is help somebody, do breathing exercises and get grounded about that. I don't want to get grounded about that. I want to be unsettled about that, right? I want to be discomforted about that because that's what's required to make change, right? And so many times that's where those staff-centered teams, okay, one person will say something rough like, actually, Vic, I actually think you've been really pushing that agenda and we haven't had enough time to talk about that. And I'll be like, well, okay, but you know what? Every time I bring this up, you guys keep talking about the damn parking lots and we never get to it. And then someone else can be like, okay, I think both of you are saying the same thing. I think maybe we should have tea, and it's like they're trying to smooth it over. And it's like that person, we can tolerate this much. We're not throwing eggs at each other or calling each other assholes, right? We're having a difficult conversation and we need to do that, right? So it's on everybody. That's why it's collective accountability. At that time, I want anybody in the team to say, okay, I think we're all trying to make this smoother or nicer. Maybe we could let's just stick with the useful stuff. What's serving clients? For us to go to tea right now or for us to figure this out, right? And so that's the question that's the recursive question that's always floating over my head is where are clients in this conversation? And if we're losing ourselves to gossip, then I just ask, I don't solve the gossip or anything. I just say, what has this got to do with clients? Tell me what family this is in service of. And there's no answer. That conversation just falls to the ground. You have to have relationships of respect and then we usually laugh and go, oh man, busted. And I'm that way too. Like some of us, we can get smart. Do you ever get smart in conversations where we all get smart and we're all like, all of a sudden everybody's quoting Foucault and Wittgenstein and stuff. And then, hopefully anybody in the group, collective accountability is anybody in the group needs to say, how does this serve families? And then we don't have the polite, oh, no, okay, let's finish this thought and go on. We don't finish this thought and go on. We just let it fall to the ground and the clinical supervisor, hopefully, ask a question that centers us on families, get us back, right? That kind of critique. It's not shaming, it's not blaming, but you have to do all the back work for that to work, right? We have to be fluid and imperfect allies to each other. In this moment, someone needs to lean in and be an ally to me, but in another context where I'm the clinical supervisor, I have to be an ally to that person. It's dependent all the time on access to power. What I think about is I did a long practicum with the Just Therapy people, the family-centered people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Wellington, Lower Hutt, 20 years ago. And I was there for a really long time. There was a really long intensive, and it had a lot of different folks in it, which was fantastic. And Flora Tahaka was an amazing teacher of mine there, and Kiwi Tamasisi. And Kiwi in particular just kept not calling me out, but leaning in, because she had respect for me and just telling me stuff, just saying, yeah, no, Vikki, wrong. And then she'd just like say stuff to me, like, and give it to me. And there was another woman there who was also a white woman. There was a real mix of women, real diversity of women. And Kiwi, I think, offered me a critique, and this woman said, Kiwi, you're really picking on Vikki. And I'm uncomfortable about it. She was really uncomfortable with how much I was getting, quote, picked on. And Kiwi just looked at me and she goes, are you uncomfortable? And I said, yeah. She goes, good. I said, no. I said to the person, listen, I really appreciate you having the moral courage. That was really courageous to ask Kiwi if what she was doing okay. But from my perspective, I'm here to learn this. And I went to the Just Therapy place because I was the clinical supervisor for survivors of torture. And I was working with people from 45 different cultures. Some of the nations, and some of them weren't nations because they were fighting for independence. So I don't want to get caught up in the nation state thing. And I was a white Canadian the whole time I was doing it. So I knew that I was oppressing people. I knew I was using white supremacy, and I knew I was being colonizing with some people. So that's why I sought out the Just Therapy. That's why I was there. So Kiwi was giving me a lot of critique. And then she said this, she said, and there were people that Kiwi gave critique to who, like, I thought they were going to break down and cry. And she never said anything else to them, And she said, look, I'm giving Vikki critique because she's seen my people, and she's seen them for a long time. And she's going to see them, and she's in it for the long haul. So I have to teach her. I have to teach her. It wasn't about me. It wasn't a gift to me, although I took it as a gift, because critique is always a gift from the oppressed person on their backs to educate me in my privilege, right? It's never an equal process, right? But on the other hand, I also felt like, my accountability as a fluid ally is I have to stay in the game because everybody has taught me everything I know. And my accountability to that is to stay in social justice work throughout a lifetime of paid and unpaid work, right? So that being an ally to each other, sometimes other people can think it's something wild. I think about being at the homelessness march last year, or a couple of years ago, they all run into each other. But homelessness is a huge, massive problem in Vancouver. Now, if you want to go on the Peace March or the Reconciliation March, well, there's a march. The word reconciliation is to reconcile. We're not ready to reconcile. You don't reconcile genocide, you stop it. But anyway, you go on that march, there's thousands more people than cops. You go on the homelessness march, there's more cops than protesters, okay? And it's risky. And it's more risky to homeless people than to other people, right? So there's some of us as activists and a lot of really at-risk homeless people. We're marching along, and a guy who's housed, that's my read on it, and an activist and very passionate and committed, and he's got a just anger, as Marge Piercy would say, and he's pissed at the police. He's very pissed off the police, righteously. And so he's yelling things at the cops that you would yell things at the cops if you were pissed off at the cops. But the risk is not to him. The risk is to the homeless folks, because one of those guys is going to cross the street and get pulled over and written up for jaywalking, and then they're going to run him through for other stuff, and he's going to be incarcerated that night, right? Because this guy pissed off this cop and shamed this cop and tried to humiliate this particular person, who's going to respond to their humiliation with some way to repair their own dignity, which will be to do their job, right? I don't like their job. But I didn't decide we're going to have a policing frame. We have one, right? So I'm not defending what the police is going to do, but it's predictable, right? And so this guy is like shouting in the face of this cop. So I just run over to him, I grab him, I pull him back, and I said, dude, shut up. What you're doing, don't yell at the cops like that, because nothing's going to happen to you and me, man. They're going to take Wayne, okay? This cop gets pissed off enough, you and I aren't getting hurt. And he was like, oh yeah, right. Sorry, I'm just so pissed. I'm like, I know, we're pissed off. That's why we're here. We have a tactic. We agreed we're not attacking the cops. We're going to march. So that's the tactic. Let's keep with this. That kind of accountability, you know what? There's a pre-existing unity, respect, and dignity for that guy because he was in the march with me. I don't think of him as a wingnut or a terrible man or a patriarch or any of that crap. He's heartbroken and taken this issue very seriously, and I want to be in solidarity with him. That's why I owe it to him to not do more harm that's actually going to land on a homeless person, right? In activism, we know how to do this stuff. We know how to do it before we meet each other because there's that pre-existing unity and there's practices of cultures of critique. Activism, direct action activism, always works this way, right? We're continually on the edge trying to invent the new thing, a new tactic that's a response to an old oppression, right? Because all of our tactics get co-opted and taken over and depoliticized. That's not any reason for us to despair. It's a reason for us to come up with more creative tactics and more solidarity, right? So what I'm trying to do is just bring that kind of analysis back into our community work. So, you know, that's what I mean by ally work. That ally work is, I'm not an ally just because I say I am. In that moment, I was an ally to that guy. And I was an ally to the homeless guys we were marching with too, right? Because in that moment, I did it. But it's a moment-to-moment thing, alliedness. It's not an identity like I'm an ally, I get the t-shirt. And being an ally is a mark of privilege. It is not a badge of honor. It's nothing great. You know, you're an ally because you have privilege. And we're not trustworthy as allies because allies can always choose to leave anti-imperialist, anti-oppressive, anti-racist movements, right? Because we can just go home. And yeah. So what I think about then the next thing and the last thing really to do is about making repair. You know, and I'm going to read you this quote from Bell Hooks, who's a black feminist thinker from the United States who I think we all know and have great respect for. For me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? Because we're in the change business. If we don't think that we as workers can change and come back, then I think that's a core competency to be able to do change work with families, right? So we have to be able to do the hard work of repair and seeing the work of repair as an ethical stance. It's something that's actually required, right? And to do this, we have to be working at being accountable and resist being guilty. I'm Irish Catholic and guilt was something that was given to me to do. It's a cultural teaching. Many people's culture have it, right? I'm not saying guilt is a totally bad idea from a spiritual point of view, I guess, but it's an unethical point of view as a social activist. Guilt it's inward, right? Accountability goes outwards, right? We need to respond with accountability and not guilt. And that accountability is a call to action, to do things different, and not just to make repair, but to learn from that, like I said, from Paulo Freire and the popular education movement, which was informed by all kinds of activist movements, right, of oppressed people. You take in the face of oppression, we take action, then we reflect on our action, and we learn new actions, and we make repair where we transgressed. And when we make repair, we need to do real things to make repair. So I know in this country, in Australia, you just had your 10th anniversary of your apology from the government. And Canada's around 10 years the same time. You know, the apologies sound outrageously similar. Did you know that? Yeah, there was a horrible history. Like that's in both of them. History wasn't horrible. There were people doing political violence. It wasn't just horrible. It wasn't history. There were actors doing things. If we look at the repair that's required, as I started, you know, for colonization, right? You know, your government has apologized for the stolen generation. Like I said before, colonization is invasion, occupation, genocide, and assimilation, of which the stolen generation was one tactic. So they've come and apologized. We've apologized for one tactic. Canada has done the same thing. I think about men who've been violent in relationship, and I work a lot with men who've been violent in relationship and men who have raped women and been sexually violent with them. They don't get to apologize. We just don't start with apology, do we? I hold men's feet to the fire. I believe in the culture of accountable men, and I believe in transformation, and I'm going to hold this man 100% accountable for everything he's done. So what we start with is taking responsibility for what you did, naming what you did. And then the second thing we have to do is name all of the potential harms. Any man who's willing to hit a woman is willing to murder her. So in Australia and in Canada, a woman is murdered every week by her male partner, right? And we know the most dangerous day in a woman's life is the day her ex-husband gets divorce papers. It's the riskiest day in her life. So we don't just let men acknowledge what they did. I hit her and she broke her arm. But you hit her, but she could have hit her head on the desk on the way down and she'd be dead, right? And then your children wouldn't have a mother, right? Then you'd be in jail, they'd have no father. So now they're in care, all right? Like there's potential harms. I get a big whiteboard and we map out all of the potential harms, the harms that have been caused and the potential harms. This is the work we do, right? And this is big work. This is a long time of work. And then the third step is to make repair, right? And again, like I said, if the abuse is public, the apology or the repair must be public. But then we need to make repair where it's possible to make repair. And what is required and doable to make this right. And that man is doing everything there that he can. If his children never want to see him again, that's about making repair and writing a letter to his children and then making sure they never get it. You know, making a commitment to me and him that if he ever walks and sees them in public, he will turn around and make sure they never see him. That is his job. That's how he gets his job as a father back. We need to give these men their jobs back. That doesn't mean they're going to cuddle their kids, right? So, you know, the honorable man, his job as a father is to love his children and protect his children. That's what most guys tell me. I'm not a father, so I don't know. I always ask them, what's the job? And so to love and honor that kid, you're going to make sure he never sees you again because he doesn't want to, because you make his life unsafe. Just seeing you is unsafe for him and he doesn't want to see you. So that's what you do, right? That's the make and repair. You have to make then a plan to never do it again. And then you have to do the hard thing, which is you have to not do it again, okay? This is all of the work we do with men, and then think about what we've done in both of our colonized states, settler states, where we jumped to this apology. We didn't do any of these steps. Most settlers, including me, I don't really have a real handle on the real number one, what did we do? And I've worked with many First Nations community, Aboriginal communities, Métis communities, Two-Spirit folks, and been invited to reserves and into circles. I've been very gifted by many teachings, and I don't have a full layout of what it is that's really been lost, right? And so I think about in Canada, our Prime Minister apologized yet again, just this year, just a month ago, I think, to Labrador and Newfoundland for residential schools. And then the next day went to the Supreme Court of Canada and made sure that First Nations folks couldn't get what they won in the Supreme Court 4 years in a row. Cindy Blackstock's case that the Canadian government is not giving Indigenous children the same things other kids are getting in terms of education, mental health, and stuff like that. And so, you know, the Supreme Court of Canada, 4 years in a row, we've appealed it. You know, so how do you apologize for residential school one day and go to the Supreme Court and make sure children don't get what they need the next day? You know, if a man just called and said, I'm sorry, we're not saying, oh yeah, we're good, right? This hard work of repair is the way we have to do repair with each other when we transgress. We have to do all of these steps with each other when we transgress against each other. It's not just calling out and it's not just apologizing, right? It's leaning in with relationships of respect and dignity, and then doing the hard work of repair, and all of it collective, all of it with each other. We do it in solidarity. It's not on your back. It's not going to be left to you to do alone. You know, the alternative is just to betray our clients and to betray each other, right? And the work is just too hard to try to keep yourself well or just or ethical, right? And we've got to, So I'm going to quote Janice Abbott. She runs Atira, which is feminist-based housing in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And she's quoting somebody else, but I'm referencing her because she's the one who brought it to my context, okay? So this is what Janice Abbott says about all of this work we're doing. We are all in a rickety boat on a stormy sea, and we owe each other a terrible loyalty. So thanks so much for listening and having me here, and I hope this was useful.